What's up guys, and welcome to the second part of my stress testing tutorial. So before we dive into to all of this, there is a couple of questions that we need to answer before we start with the testing. And this is really important, so please don't skip this part. And the first thing that you need to do before you even do anything is to identify the purpose of your testing, because this is really important. Because how can you really test anything if you don't know what you're supposed to be testing? So one of the purposes might be to identify the bottlenecks in the system, and this is obviously done in order to improve your code. So for example, if you try to find places in the API in this case where the system totally slows down or hangs up when there's a lot more than, I don't know, X amount of users, stuff like that. So the quality of the code, basically. Or is it to verify that the changes that you made didn't break anything? And this is basically, I would say that this is probably done multiple times. So if you have a test suite that you're running, before you, I don't know, every time you put something on the stage server or something like that, you can run the stress test to make sure that it's still as fast as it was before you implemented the new stuff. So this is also another scenario. And the most common one that I think of is probably that you assure that you can take X amount of users. It's really hard to really assure that you can take them, but at least you can get some hint that you probably can take them. And I would say that this is probably the most common scenario, because everybody builds their stuff, you know, and especially if you don't have proper project management and stuff like that, suddenly at the end, when everything is built, the project manager realized that, oh, we need to verify that we can actually deal with all the users before they put it on the live server and put the marketing in it, you know, just before the winter or Black Friday or something like that. So everybody is a bit nervous, can we really take the traffic and stuff like that. And this is probably the situation you're in right now, because everybody is being nervous about, will it actually crash, you know? So I bet that this is why most people watch the tutorial, and for educational purposes, I hope also. So before we do it, and obviously we need to take different approaches, whether we're doing stuff like these or we're doing this one. But I'm gonna go through both of them a little bit, I think. And before we start, there is a couple of things that you need to sort out and verify, because otherwise you can end up in trouble, you know. So before you start, if you're gonna do this on, I'm assuming you're gonna also test this on a live server. So you're gonna check, is there any kind of rate limiting on the server? And by this, I mean some APIs and servers implement that if you make too many requests coming from the same IP address, you lock them out. And this is done for security reasons, like DOS attacks, stuff like that. So in order to deal with people trying to put your server down but being stupid and trying it from one single IP address. So this is rate limiting. And also, when you do this, is it okay if the server you're testing can crash? Because it is highly likable that whenever you push it too far, the server, or at least the application, might go down and everything might crash. And are you in a state where you can be responsible for this? And if not, is there a stage server that you can use instead? Probably a better case. I think if you're going to do this on the live server, I think the best case is to take a copy of the database and move it to the stage server and test it out there with the exact same setup. But this is something that you need to look into in your specific environment, because this is nothing that I can really tell about, you know. And also, is this your API that you're testing? So please don't test this on some kind of Google API or stuff like that, because they're gonna know that you're doing this, you know, because you make too many requests, and it doesn't really look good, because from the outside it looks like you're doing a DOS attack, and that's not really something that the builders of an API is gonna take kindly to if you do it on their API. So make sure that it is your API that you're testing. And this, I cannot stress this enough. And also make sure that you actually are doing this at the right time. So don't do it on the Black Friday sales, when there is a lot of users in the system. Do this sometimes and be prepared to like reboot it immediately if should it crash, But I mean, if it is sensitive for crashing, maybe you shouldn't test it like this in the first place. So with that being said, another question that you need to take into account is caching. And by this I mean, if you don't know what caching is, like for example, the first time you make a request to some kind of URL, like start.v1 and then something like this. Let's say that this is an endpoint that you're testing. If you make HTTP GET request to this, let's say that this is a GET request that you're doing. And if you're gonna keep on doing requests like this, you're gonna make a lot of tests on this endpoint. We're just using one URL all the time. What's gonna happen is that this first time is not gonna be cached. So there you might hit the database. And so you're starting from the application, going down, and then you go down here into the database, and then you go up and respond, But the second time you come around, this request is going to be cached right at the top. So you're just going to hit the cache and immediately back. And this goes for all the following requests, obviously. So this kind of depends on why you are stress testing in the first place. Because the stress testing, they might be done because you're actually trying to verify that this actually works. And in that case, everything is fine. You should obviously not turn off the cache if there are caches that you're testing. But in most cases, it's not. You want to make sure that if you want to identify bottlenecks and improve your code, definitely turn off the cache. Verify that changes didn't break anything. Try to also, at least to start with, turn off the caches. And even if you are testing the caches, it might be good to turn them off initially so that you can have something to compare with. So at first you might turn it off, do all the testing, and you can see that it doesn't take the amount of traffic that it should. And then you turn on the caches, and then it obviously should take all the requests in proper timing and not crash and stuff like that. So caches, definitely something to consider. And also look into how caching is done. Is it done only by URLs, or is there some other kind of procedure for caching? So that's that. And also, when you're gonna stress test this, is there any data that's being generated by the request that you're making, and how is that affecting the state? Actually, let me copy this up here because these are related. So when you create data, how is the server state going to be when you're done with the testing? Is it okay to have a lot of crap lying around, or should you create some kind of traceability to the data that you're creating? Is it fine? If you're doing it on the local host, you can just drop the database, I guess. But if you do this on the live server, how would you clear out all the crap users that you created and stuff like that? So that's also something to consider, because there might be data generated by the request that you're making. Where are you going to start testing? Does everything need to be tested? Probably not, because I assume that you have some kind of goal with your testing, and then you probably should look into your code, and you probably know what endpoints or HTTP requests that will take the longest time, and obviously that's where you should be focusing. Or maybe you can try to identify the endpoints that are being used the most and test how much traffic they can take in order to kind of identify the standard behavior on the website. Maybe you have some other kind of way of testing it, like looking into Google Analytics, that you have that on your web page to see what the most common web requests are, and maybe test those. So I don't think it's a good approach to try to test everything because it's not going to be feasible. You need to focus on the stuff that's important, basically. So try to figure out that as well. Which endpoints are the most important? Take the most critical. And also another issue is, do you need to test full sessions? And by that I mean a session, for example, could be that one user logs in, then he goes to the user details, edit them, save the data, and then log out. That might be a session. And I'm going to show you how you can test stuff like that with a lot of users. So let's say that you want to have, I don't know, 100 users to start with that goes into their user details and edits something and then logs out. There is a way of testing this that I'm going to show in the coming tutorials. And this is really powerful because you can then verify so much more complex logic than you could by just like hitting URLs. So that's something we're going to look into. And also you should figure out if you have some way of mocking out the database. And this obviously need to have support in the code that you have available to you, if you have it available. So if you're using, I don't know, like a repository pattern, you can just switch out to a mock instance of the database, so no data is actually created. And then you also need to figure out what you're testing. So if you're not testing the full sequence of hitting the database, is that fine in your application? Or do you actually also need to test that the database is working as it should? Because sometimes you want to test it as close to the live environment as possible, if not in the live environment. So yeah, that was a lot of questions, and I hope that you at this point have some kind of idea what of this you're supposed to be doing. And also you might need to verify with the administrations of the servers and check with, I don't know, management or something that everything is okay. Like, is it okay if I test this right now, or is it critical because it might go down, stuff like that. So verify that everything is fine before you continue, because if you're testing on localhost, you're fine, obviously. That's your computer. But if you're testing on a live environment, think about that for a while before you start. So right, so thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and please leave a comment if anything is unclear, and I'll see you on the next tutorial.